At the end of 2022, engineers conducted a routine inspection of the Blossom Narrows Bridge. This structure had only been opened a few months prior and was considered the greatest achievement of the city of Port Blossom. The inspection was standard. An ultrasonic scanner was used to check the integrity of the concrete pillars. Normally, such inspections proceed calmly and rarely reveal anything serious. However, this time, the device registered an anomaly. Inside the seventh pillar, a cavity with a dense inclusion appeared. At first glance, this could have been a casting defect or forgotten construction debris. To rule out any risks, the engineers decided to open the area. The work was carried out at night, without press or witnesses. As the tool began to break open the concrete, the sound changed. Instead of a dense echo, a dull resonance was heard. After a few minutes, a piece of fabric appeared in the resulting gap. Initially, it was thought to be remnants of the packaging material, but it soon became clear there was a human inside the pillar. The recovery took several hours. After identification, there was no longer any doubt. Inside the pillar was Ava Miller, who had been reported missing since October of the previous year. Her disappearance was then considered a runaway from home, and the case gradually ended up in the archives. At this stage, the police received a direct answer to the main question: where she had been all this time. But with that, a new level of mystery unfolded. Ava had entered the structure after her life had already ended. This meant someone had deliberately hidden her inside the pillar. It was precisely from this moment that the case shifted from the category of missing person to a new investigation. Investigators returned to the events of that October night when Ava disappeared and began to check everyone who had been near her at the time. Ava Miller. Many in Port Blossom knew her name, but not as the victim of a sensational case, but as a source of problems. In a small town where everyone's actions immediately become gossip, her behavior stood out. She did not fit into the usual norms, and it was precisely this that drew attention to her. During the day, Ava could usually be found in the city center, with headphones, loud music on her phone, and her habitually absent gaze. She wore black jackets, adorned herself with massive rings and bracelets, and put on so much eye makeup that teachers repeatedly admonished her. Adults called her stubborn and difficult, but to her peers, she seemed free and independent. Her daily life consisted of simple but constant conflicts. At home, there were eternal arguments. Her parents tried to control her. She resisted. The questions were always the same. Where were you? Why did you come back after curfew? Why do you need that boy? Particularly sensitive was the topic of her relationship with Leo, who was several years older than her. The adults mistrusted him, believing he was leading her astray. But Ava saw things differently. The more her parents forbade it, the more she clung to him. At school, everything repeated in a different form. Teachers saw that she was smart, but at the same time, she demonstratively ignored the rules. Skipping classes, sarcastic answers, emphasized indifference to lessons. Classmates perceived this as part of her image. She did not try to please, but on the contrary, did everything to stand out. And for many, that seemed like strength. All these qualities created a certain image around her. So when Ava explained to her parents, "You'll never see me again," no one took it seriously. It was a familiar scenario, a conflict, loud words, a dramatic exit, and the inevitable return after 1 or 2 days. The parents were tired, the neighbors sighed, the teachers shrugged. No one believed her threats were real. So, when she actually left in October 2021 and did not return, no one panicked in the first few days. The parents contacted the police, but even there, no particular reasons for immediate action were seen. The official version sounded simple: teenage rebellion, ran away from home, the desire to start a new life in a big city. Especially since Portland was only an hour's drive away, and many actually believed she could have gone there. However, what looked like another act in a familiar family drama became the point of no return that evening. An argument, a slamming door, and disappearance. From that moment on, the normal world in which Ava was part of everyday discussions ceased to exist. It was then that a new phase began, the official investigation into her disappearance. "You'll never see me again." Ava hurled this phrase at her parents in the middle of an argument. At that moment, it sounded like a common threat, familiar to any family where relationships are broken. No one paid special attention to these words. In the house, they had already grown accustomed to loud remarks, slamming doors, and intense emotions. But now, knowing how everything ended, These words take on a completely different weight. That evening, everything began with a mundane scene. The parents tried again to restrict her contact with Leo. He was older, had no stable job, and aroused the suspicion of the adults. The conversation quickly escalated into accusations and shouting. Ava refused to hear a single argument. She threw on her jacket, grabbed her backpack, and walked out without looking back. The door slammed so loudly that silence fell over the house for a few seconds. The parents exchanged brief sentences, each hoping that everything would repeat according to the old scenario. Usually, she came back after 1 or 2 hours, sometimes later, but she always came back. This time, hours passed, and the house remained empty. First, the parents tried to stay calm. Time passed slowly. 10 o'clock in the evening, 11, midnight. With each minute, the tension grew. Anger gradually gave way to fear. They called her mobile phone. The calls were rejected or didn't go through. They looked in her room. An open magazine lay on the table, a discarded jacket on the bed, soft music played from the speakers. Everything looked as if she had only left for a minute. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, it became clear. This was not another rebellion. Neither her friends nor Leo knew where she was. At night, the city slept. The streets were empty in the rain, and the probability of her returning on her own rapidly decreased. The parents did not wait until morning. The call to the police station became the starting point of a new reality. From that moment on, Ava Miller was officially considered missing. Her personal belongings had remained at home, contact with friends had been lost, and the usual leave and return scenario no longer worked. This is where the first phase of the investigation begins. The police had to find out. Was it another runaway from home or something far more dangerous? When the report reached the police, investigators immediately leaned on the simplest version, a runaway from home. In their eyes, this seemed logical. A conflict with parents, loud farewell words, a closed door. In small towns, such stories repeated too often to be considered something extraordinary. A patrol car drove to Highway 101, the road leading north towards Portland. People often hitched rides there who wanted to leave without a plan or ticket. The inspection was superficial. The headlights swept over the roadside. Tire marks and rare footprints were collected. A photo was kept in the file, the impression of a massive boot next to a gravel driveway. The image was filed in the folder, but at that moment, it did not trigger any associations for the investigators. Just another trace among dozens of others. After that, routine work began. Bus stations were checked. Neither the cashiers nor the drivers remembered Ava. Inquiries were sent to neighboring districts, but the answer was the same everywhere: no matches. The police called her friends and acquaintances. Most said the same thing. Yes, she often threatened to leave. She probably finally did it for real. In parallel, Leo was questioned. He seemed tense, answered vaguely, and said he had driven around the city to cool off. But there was no direct evidence of his involvement. His phone was located in a different part of the city, and witnesses confirmed seeing him there that night. At that time, the police decided not to investigate further. None of this was a shock to the town either. Conversations in shops and gas stations came down to one thing: she's gone. And that's a good thing. She'll come back when she wants. The parents' concern grew steadily, but the community quickly got used to the idea that Ava had started a new life somewhere. After a few weeks, the intensive search dwindled. No leads were found, the clues ran out. The Ava Miller case moved from active cases to the archives, an ordinary folder with a number and the dry notation, missing. Thus ended the first phase, formal and almost inconclusive. But it was precisely this archived trace, the solitary photo of the boot print on the gravel driveway, that would later become the decisive piece of evidence that led the investigation into a new round. In such stories, there is always one figure on whom suspicion falls first. In Port Blossom, that man was Leo, Ava's boyfriend. Slightly older, with a reputation for being unreliable, without a stable job, with a shady circle of friends. For the parents, he had long been the reason for all conflicts in the house. For neighbors and acquaintances, that guy who led Ava astray. And when she left into the night precisely after an argument with him and did not return, the puzzle fit together all too obviously. The investigators made no secret of it. Leo seemed like the ideal suspect. He was the last person to see Ava alive, and that automatically put him at the center of attention. The interrogation took place in the first 24 hours. His statements are preserved in the records. Leo claimed that after the argument, he simply drove around the city. He explained this by saying he wanted to calm down and clear his head. But the circumstantial evidence spoke against him. Cameras at the city exit had not captured his car. He muddled the exact time. In his memories, he constantly stumbled, changed details, sometimes saying he had been on the outskirts of the city, then claiming he had visited acquaintances whose names he did not provide. To the police, this looked suspicious. The interrogation lasted hours. He was asked the same questions repeatedly in the hope of catching him in a lie. Leo was nervous, bit his lips, often asked for water. To direct questions, he responded evasively. His alibi, driving alone around the city, seemed too convenient and at the same time unconfirmed. However, there was no direct evidence against him. Traces of activity were found on his phone, calls and internet sessions captured by cell towers in a completely different part of the city. Some casual witnesses later confirmed seeing his car near the industrial area. Around the time Ava disappeared, he could not physically be in two places at once. Nevertheless, the shadow of suspicion did not dissipate. For Ava's parents, Leo remained the culprit. In the eyes of the neighbors, he was the main suspect, regardless of the official status of the case. He continued to live in the city, but now a stigma weighed on him. On the street, he caught glances, conversations behind his back. Everyone knew he had been interrogated, and many believed he was still hiding the truth. For the police, the situation seemed to be at a dead end. They could repeatedly summon Leo, pressure him with questions, hoping for a random mistake. But without found evidence and without the fact of Ava's discovery itself, they could not press official charges against him. The case stagnated. Leo remained at large, but under unofficial surveillance. More than 1 year passed in this way. And all this time, Leo's name appeared in the investigation files as the most important but unconfirmed lead. The situation only changed when the Blossom Narrows Bridge revealed its secret and the city received real evidence for the first time. When the pillar was opened, the same thought occurred to everyone present. Ava had gotten inside during the pouring. This precisely explained her posture, her position within the concrete mass, and many were sure she had suffocated under a layer of cement. But this version collapsed the moment the first forensic pathologist's results were on the table. No traces of cement mixture were found in her lungs. This ruled out the possibility of poured in alive. She had already entered the structure lifeless. Further analysis provided even more concrete facts. The experts determined the exact cause, a strong blow to the head. The injury was incompatible with life and coincided in time with the night of her disappearance in October 2021. Coincidence was ruled out. Her life had ended precisely that night. The report dashed the last hope of an accident. It was not a misfortune, not an escape, but a deliberate act. But the specialist's conclusions were not limited to that. Characteristic injuries, small scratches and signs of a struggle were found on Ava's hands. Fibers from a rare industrial work glove were found on her jacket. The experts emphasized this was not everyday fabric, but a special material used on construction sites. Another detail, particles of cement dust and construction debris remained under her fingernails. All of this directly connected her disappearance to the Blossom Narrows construction site. Furthermore, the report pointed to the absence of signs of long-distance transport. This meant that the tragedy had occurred near the construction site itself. The body was not transported over long distances, but brought directly to the object after the incident. For the investigators, this was a crucial turn. It was now clear the perpetrator knew the construction site from the inside, understood the process, and also had access to it at night. For the city, the report's findings were a shock. For 1 year, everyone had lived with the idea that Ava had fled to Portland or Seattle. Although her parents didn't fully believe it, they had to listen to neighbors' conversations about rebellion and escape. Now it turned out that it had been a crime from the beginning, and that this criminal walked among them, perhaps driving past them every day in his work truck. After the report was released, the case became a priority again. The investigative team returned to the archival materials, retrieved the lists of everyone who had worked on the site that night. Dozens of names came under scrutiny: concrete workers, foremen, drivers. Everyone was summoned for questioning, their statements compared with phone data and shift schedules. A common missing person case turned into a murder investigation, And now, the police were no longer looking for a runaway, but for the person who had brought her to the construction site on that October night in 2021 and hidden her in the concrete. This became the starting point for a new wave of interrogations and the search for the true suspect. A list of 34 names lay on the investigator's desk in early December 2022. These were all who were officially present at the Blossom Narrows Bridge construction site on the night of Ava's disappearance. The list included laborers, concrete workers, drivers, shift supervisors, and foremen. Any one of them could have been a key figure. The problem was that among dozens of similar individuals, they had to find that one needle in a haystack. Interrogations followed one after another. Workers were summoned to the precinct, seated in a small room with gray walls, and repeatedly asked the same questions. Where were you on the night of October 14, 2021? With whom did you work? What did you see? The answers were almost verbatim. Finished shift, went home, didn't notice anything unusual, no strangers on site. Investigators recorded every sentence, but the records painted a monotonous picture. Sometimes they managed to latch onto small inconsistencies. Someone misstated the concrete mixer's arrival time, another confused the master's name, yet another spoke differently about the weather than his colleague. But all of this did not go beyond the bounds of normal human memory. The overall picture seemed smooth, and the further the interrogations progressed, the more it seemed that the case would once again reach a dead end. However, attention was drawn to a detail that initially seemed insignificant. One of the workers, 52-year-old Frank Kowalski, stated that he had arrived on site on time, as always. His words sounded confident, but the gatekeeper's documents showed something different. His punch-in time was 20 minutes later. On a construction site where every entry was recorded, such a discrepancy seemed strange. The investigators began to press. Kowalski changed his explanations. First, he spoke of a traffic jam. Then he claimed he had simply gotten the time wrong later, that he might have forgotten to report immediately at the gatehouse. But the more he justified himself, the more nervous he became. His voice grew sharper, his answers shorter. He avoided eye contact. Against the backdrop of dozens of even, almost sterile statements, his reaction stood out. The other workers responded calmly, repeating the usual details of their shift. Kowalski, however, stumbled, contradicted himself, and seemed to want to conceal the fact of his lateness. For the investigators, this was the first signal that they were not just dealing with another ordinary construction worker. 20 minutes, a short period, but precisely such time intervals proved decisive. Where was Kowalski during those minutes? Why was he trying to conceal his lateness? And most importantly, why would a man with nothing to hide get entangled in explanations? From that moment on, his name was no longer one of 34 on the list. It was highlighted in red marker in the investigators' files. Frank Kowalski became a figure to be watched carefully, and for a long time. And it was precisely here that the investigation began to take concrete shape. The police shifted from a general review of workers to targeted surveillance of a specific person. While investigators evaluated the interrogations of the construction workers, forensic experts continued their quiet but diligent work. On the lab table lay Ava's black jacket, found with her in the concrete pillar. Outwardly, there was nothing unusual about it. Cement stains, hardened creases, fittings that had survived the pouring. But under the microscope, details emerged that the naked eye would never have perceived. An expert noticed several foreign fibers stuck in the fabric at shoulder and forearm height. They were thin, bright blue threads that clearly did not belong to the jacket itself. The first step was to check the composition. Spectral analysis revealed the fibers were synthetic, high strength, and used in the manufacture of protective gloves with increased wear resistance. Such products were expensive and used not in households but on industrial facilities. At first glance, the discovery seemed like a breakthrough. The fibers indicated contact with a person who worked with their hands and used professional protective equipment. However, when investigators requested data from the construction company, the picture became more complicated. Exactly such gloves were issued to all employees of the bridge construction site. Every one of the 34 men on the list had them as part of their standard equipment. A paradoxical situation arose. On the one hand, the police had a real physical connection between Ava and the site. It could now be said with certainty. She had not accidentally gotten into the concrete pillar. Her contact with the workers was materially proven. On the other hand, the evidence pointed to an entire group. The fibers could have belonged to any of the employees. The evidence narrowed the circle, but did not yet allow pointing a finger at a specific person. For the investigation, this was a turning point. For 1 year, the case lay in the archives as voluntary departure, without a single direct clue. Now, they had a piece of evidence in hand, and it stated one thing. Ava had not simply disappeared somewhere in the city. She was at the construction site and had contact with those who worked there on the night of her disappearance. The investigative team changed its tactics. From now on, each worker was viewed not just as a name on a list, but as a potential contact to Ava. Forensic experts began comparing the found fibers with batches of gloves that had been purchased in different months. In parallel, investigators checked shift schedules and determined who was near pillar number 7 that night. In the files, this was referred to as narrowing the circle. Indeed, from this moment on, the police had a solid basis for pressure. It was no longer about abstract suspicions, but about a factual connection between the victim and the specific crime scene. And that meant that further steps would aim to identify the person who had used the construction site to conceal their actions. The police faced a question that had previously seemed almost hopeless. How do you check the alibis of 34 workers more than 1 year after the events? People forget details, confuse dates, invent excuses. Some sincerely did not remember, others might deliberately be hiding something. Each new interrogation increasingly resembled the previous one. That's when investigators decided to turn away from human memory and go to where lies are impossible, into the world of digital footprints. Phones became their most important weapon. Even if a person does not make calls or send messages, the device still regularly connects to cell towers, leaving behind coordinates. These points record every movement, and when assembled into a line, they create a route with an accuracy of up to a quarter mile. In early 2023, the investigative team requested a huge amount of data from mobile phone providers for all 34 employees of the construction site who were there on the night of Ava's disappearance. What came back to the department resembled a gigantic spreadsheet. Tens of thousands of rows with time, cell tower ID, and approximate coordinates. To understand these data volumes, specialists in digital evidence were called in. They compared each row with shift logs and employee routes. This took weeks. Gradually, the picture cleared. Most workers were uninteresting. Their phones showed stable behavior, leaving home in the evening, arriving at the construction site, then the night shift, followed by returning home. No unexpected jumps in coordinates, no strange deviations. Their alibis were automatically confirmed without a single question. It seemed as if this review would only solidify the dead end. But then one file stood out from the others. The data from Frank Kowalski, a 52-year-old concrete worker, did not match the visitor log. That evening, when Ava disappeared, his phone left the construction site for 20 minutes. The signal was captured by cell towers in the area of residential neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city, just 1 mile from the place where eyewitnesses later said they saw Ava hitchhiking on the highway. First, the investigators double-checked everything. Perhaps a mistake, a system failure, an inaccuracy of coordinates, but the data from different sources matched. Kowalski's phone had indeed left the construction site zone and moved towards the city before returning to the object. The interval, 20 minutes. Exactly those 20 minutes about which he had lied during questioning when explaining his delay. This discovery turned the case. His previous excuses about a traffic jam, forgetfulness, a mistake while clocking in at the gatehouse now appeared as a deliberate lie. He had not only been mistaken, he had consciously concealed that he had left the construction site that night. And most importantly, the phone's route matched in time and place the last minutes Ava was seen free. For the investigators, this was a crucial moment. For 1 year, the investigation had stalled. The interrogations of the workers only yielded repetitive stories. The evidence with the glove fibers remained too general. But now, the police had a real digital trail that directly connected Kowalski to the disappearance. The analysis lasted for several weeks. His calls, text messages, and internet usage were checked. On the night of the disappearance, there were no calls, no active sessions. The phone moved silently, without a single sound. From an expert's point of view, this looked like a deliberate attempt not to leave any unnecessary digital traces. Now the police had everything necessary to move to the next stage. They obtained a lawful reason for a search, the chance to find physical evidence in Kowalski's house and car. The investigators could no longer consider him one of many. Now he was the main and only candidate who had lied, was nervous, and was precisely at the location where Ava had disappeared. This evidence became the turning point. The investigation, which had stalled for years, now had a concrete suspect, and for the first time in a long time, the investigators could act confidently and purposefully. Next, it remained to check what was hidden in his garage and in the old pickup truck he had hastily sold just a few months after the tragedy. Before the investigators focused their efforts on Frank Kowalski, they decided to clarify an old question that had permeated the case from the beginning. In every case, there is a figure who is easiest to blame. For Ava, this man was her boyfriend, Leo Grant. From day one, he was considered the ideal suspect, older, with a reputation for inconsistency, at the center of the last argument, after which Ava left the house. All of this made him a convenient target for speculation and gossip. For 1 year, Leo lived under this burden. He was shunned in the city. People whispered behind his back. Ava's parents looked at him with hatred. Every new interrogation only reinforced the feeling that the police were trying to break him. His convoluted answers and weak alibi seemed to give rise to doubts. But now, the investigation had a tool that could finally put an end to it. The same digital methods that had implicated Kowalski were now to be applied to Leo. The query in the system took several minutes. Rows of numbers and timestamps appeared on the computer screen. The cell towers recorded every connection of his phone on the night of the disappearance. At first, the data seemed dry and incomprehensible. Coordinates, intervals, signal frequencies. But when transferred to a city map, the picture became clear. Leo was indeed not near the construction site. The time matched to the minute. At the moment Ava left the house and walked towards the highway, his phone reliably lit up in the industrial area on the other side of the city. His movements were also recorded there later, after Ava had already disappeared. The signals left no room for doubt. Leo could not have been physically near her. The investigators checked everything. They compared witness testimonies, checked cameras at the city's entrances and exits. The puzzle fit together. His car had been seen on the road. A few acquaintances confirmed that he was indeed driving alone through the city. All of this exactly matched the digital data. In the end, what had previously looked like a weak and suspicious alibi became a clearly confirmed fact. For the police, this was an important milestone. Leo was no longer considered a figure in the investigation. After 1 year, the suspicions against him were finally dropped. For him, this meant the end of constant interrogations and the eternal shadow that had haunted him since Ava's disappearance. For the investigation, it meant something else. They now had only one main suspect, implicated by both physical evidence and digital data. All attention turned to Frank Kowalski, and the next step was imminent: the search of his house and garage, where the answers to the most important questions of the case might be hidden. As the name Frank Kowalski moved into the focus of the investigation, the detectives expected to encounter the usual array of red flags. Normally, such stories are accompanied by a long list: old criminal records, neighbor complaints, conflicts with colleagues. Yet, the deeper they dug into his biography, the stranger the picture became. Kowalski had none of that. His past appeared frighteningly clean, as if he were a man with no history. Frank was born and raised in Oregon, obtained a high school education, and began working in construction early on. His family described him as quiet, even too quiet. In his youth, he had no contact with gangs, no problems with the law, and rarely drew attention to himself. He never had hobbies, no strong social connections, and that alone seemed suspicious. It was as if he had existed his entire life as a kind of human function. Come, work, go home. His private life was even drier. Frank was married, but not for long. The marriage broke up without scandals, without loud asset divisions, without lengthy court proceedings. After the divorce, he remained alone, living in a small house on the outskirts of Port Blossom. Neighbors remembered him as a taciturn man who did not initiate conversations and always kept to himself. He only went out for work or shopping. Colleagues spoke similarly about him. Unapproachable, introverted, doesn't speak unnecessarily. He performed his duties, never disagreed, but also sought no contact. No one called him aggressive or conflict-averse. But precisely this indifference and coldness were unsettling. He could work side by side with people for weeks without saying a single personal word. His file contained none of the usual red flags. No psychiatric diagnoses, no neighbor complaints, no police records. He was like a blank slate, and that made the situation even more disturbing. If a suspect has obvious motives or past problems, it's easier to form a picture. But Kowalski seemed like a phantom. He seemed to disappear between the lines of documents, leaving only emptiness. For the investigators, this became a real enigma. The lack of motives and striking characteristics did not simplify the case. Instead, it complicated it. For in this void, a new question arose. If a man, considered quiet and inconspicuous for decades, was at the center of such a story, then he had hidden his true nature for too long and too skillfully. Precisely this realization prompted the police to take the next step, the search of his garage and old pickup truck, where the truth about that October night might be hidden. The investigators knew this was their chance to pressure Kowalski. In the interrogation room, there were no superfluous words. A city map with the marked movement points of his phone on the night of Ava's disappearance was spread out on the table in front of him. Red lines showed everything: how he left the construction site, how he briefly stayed in the residential area, how he then returned. The evidence seemed undeniable. Anyone else in his place would have started to justify themselves, to get tangled up, perhaps to break under the pressure. But Kowalski's reaction was completely different. He looked up at the map, then lowered his gaze again and quietly said, "That's a mistake." This sentence became his shield. Again and again, to every new argument, to every demand, he answered the same. No emotions, no hesitation. He did not raise his voice, did not argue, did not ask for a lawyer. He just sat there, looking through the investigators, and repeated, "A mistake." His behavior resembled a stone wall against which all attempts to exert pressure shattered. The investigative team had carefully prepared for this interrogation. They structured the questions to catch him on minor details. They started gently, then moved to specifics. First, when he drove to his shift. Then, where exactly he had been during the 20-minute interval. After that, why his explanations did not match the gatekeeper's logs. And finally, they showed him the exact numbers and graphs of his phone's movements. But the result was always the same. He did not lie directly. He simply denied everything and revealed nothing. The investigators increased the pressure. One of them raised his voice. Another feigned empathy and tried to understand. They employed the good cop, bad cop method. Photos, protocols, recordings of colleagues' statements were brought into play. Everything that was supposed to unsettle him, but Kowalski remained cold and distant. At some point, it seemed as if he no longer heard what was being said to him. His face did not change. Only his hands under the table clenched into a fist. The interrogation lasted several hours. In the end, the investigators understood. He would not go further. He would not sign anything, admit anything, show the slightest crack. For the record, there was only to note his words and his refusal, but that was not enough. After leaving the room, the investigative team discussed the next steps. Everything pointed to one thing. Without physical evidence, without concrete exhibits, this man would remain a suspect without evidence. And therefore, the decision was obvious. Based on the digital data and his lies, they obtained a search warrant. A search was imminent of his garage, his house, and that old pickup truck he had sold a few months after Ava's disappearance. Now the investigation moved into a new phase, where things were to speak, not words. The search of Frank Kowalski's garage, at first glance, promised nothing special. Dusty shelves, rusty tools, boxes of junk accumulated over decades. The investigators methodically went through everything, documenting every find. And then, in a corner, in an old box, they came across a pair of worn-out work boots. To the naked eye, ordinary shoes, nothing conspicuous. But for those working on this case, the find immediately evoked an association. 1 year ago, when Ava had just disappeared, a patrol had photographed the imprint of a heavy boot on the roadside of the highway. At that time, this photo was filed, but not given much importance. There was nothing to compare the evidence with. And now, the circle closed. Kowalski's boots could be precisely the detail that connected the beginning of the investigation with its climax. The shoes were carefully packed and sent to the laboratory. The experts meticulously went to work. First, they measured the size and shape of the sole, then compared it with the image of the imprint stored in the digital archive. Every protrusion, every crack in the profile was checked. Even the smallest damages to the sole were taken into account. Such tiny signatures of shoes are impossible to replicate. The wait for the results dragged on. The investigative team knew if the match was confirmed, it would no longer be an indirect hint, but a direct physical connection between Kowalski and the location of Ava's disappearance. All talk of coincidences or errors would resolve themselves. When the verdict was announced, there were no more doubts. The experts declared the match was 100%. The imprint on the roadside and the boots from the garage, one and the same. It was the final confirmation that on the night of the disappearance, it was precisely Kowalski who was near Ava, and it was precisely he who left the traces at the place from which she never returned. Now, the police had the key that unlocked the entire case. The phone data showed his route. The fibers on the jacket confirmed contact with the construction site, and the boots put a definitive end to it. The connection between the suspect and the scene of the disappearance became direct and irrefutable. From this moment on, the investigation entered its final phase, the search for the last missing evidence and preparation for the arrest that was to conclude this story. The interrogation room was once again filled with silence. This time, the investigators changed their tactics. They no longer tried to persuade with arguments or exert pressure. A thin folder was placed on the table in front of Frank Kowalski. Inside, the expert report on the boots. The pages were neither read aloud nor commented on. The investigator simply opened the folder and turned it towards him. Then he leaned back in his chair and remained silent. The silence stretched on. The sound of the fan, the rustling of paper, and the clock on the wall were the only things filling the room. Kowalski sat motionless. For several minutes, he pretended to look away, but then his gaze drifted over the lines of the report. A photograph of the imprint from the roadside, comparison tables, the verdict, complete match. His face did not change immediately, but an attentive glance noticed small things. His jaw tensed. His fingers resting on the table began to move slowly, as if trying to wipe away invisible dirt. His shoulders slumped slightly. The investigator continued to be silent. Kowalski took several deep breaths, as if wanting to say something, but fell silent again. Finally, he looked up. His voice was low, hoarse, as if every word was difficult for him. He said, "I didn't mean to. It happened by accident." From that moment, his narrative began. Frank confessed that he was driving to his shift that night. He saw Ava on the roadside and stopped. At first, he wanted to give her a ride, but the conversation escalated into an argument. Word led to word, a sharp retort, and everything spiraled out of control. When he realized what had happened, panic overwhelmed him. The only thing that came to mind was to hide his deed. He knew there was hardly anyone at the construction site at night, so he drove her directly there. The scaffolding of the 7th pillar was already prepared for pouring. He threw her in, confident that the concrete would conceal the traces forever. The confession lasted several minutes. There was no hysteria, no remorse, just a dry recitation, as if he himself, until the very end, did not believe that he had finally said it aloud. The investigators recorded every word. Now they had everything: digital data, physical evidence, and a confession. The case, which had begun as a disappearance without a trace, ended with the official confirmation of what had happened on that October night. After that, only the final step remained: the court and the verdict that was to put a definitive end to this story. The story told by Frank Kowalski astonished the investigators with its banality. There was no elaborate plan, no complex scenario. Everything began with something ordinary, but that was precisely what made what happened so terrible. He was on his way to the night shift. The rain was pouring, the road glistened in the headlights. On the roadside stood Ava, drenched, with her hand raised. Kowalski claimed he initially didn't want to stop, but then changed his mind. She could have been cold, wet, and someone else would have picked her up anyway, he said during questioning, and that decision was the first step towards tragedy. After getting into the car, Ava was silent at first. The music played softly and they drove for a few minutes in silence. Then, according to Kowalski's own words, he tried to talk to her paternally. He began to talk about her life, about how she argued with her parents for no reason, about how she was with Leo for no good reason. He considered himself older and wiser, and decided he had to explain this to her. Ava, who had just left home after another argument, did not want to hear this. According to Kowalski, she interrupted him abruptly and said something that deeply hurt him. Only his description is preserved in the record. She said something she shouldn't have said, but he himself did not want to repeat it verbatim in court. After that, events unfolded quickly. Ava reached for the door handle to get out directly while the car was moving. It was a rainy October night, a highway, a situation where one wrong step could have ended tragically. Kowalski grabbed her arm in a panic to hold her back. A brief struggle ensued. He held her by the shoulder. She resisted. And at that moment, her head hit the side window. According to Frank, there was silence. He understood that something irreversible had happened. The driver's seat, the dashboard, the sound of rain on the roof, all merged into an image that became fixed in his memory. After that, panic set in. He understood. If he drove to the construction site now and called for help, it would be the end of his life. Police, indictment, prison. Thoughts raced through his mind that he would be blamed even more harshly than he deserved. And that's when the decision arose, to erase the traces. He knew the construction site, knew the schedule. Pillar number 7 was to be poured at dawn. The scaffolding was already finished. The reinforcement protruded with empty rods. At night, there were hardly any people on the site. He drove onto the site through the service entrance, for which he had a pass. He parked the car in a dark corner, not reached by the headlights. Kowalski claimed to have acted quickly. He pulled Ava from the pickup, carried her about 30 meters to the pillar, and lowered her into the scaffolding. Everything took no longer than 15 minutes. He was certain that the concrete poured in the morning would hide her forever. During the interrogation, he repeated, "I thought I had created the perfect hiding place." And therein lay the whole terrible simplicity of the crime. No elaborate plans, no carefully thought-out details. A random argument, a panicked reaction, the cold decision to hide the traces where no one would ever look. For the investigators, this reconstruction became the final link. The picture that had been assembled from fragments, the boot print, the glove fibers, the phone data, now took shape. From Kowalski's own mouth, they heard how everything had happened step by step. The next step was already inevitable, to bring the case to court, where the confession and the evidence were to lead to a verdict. In the courtroom, the Ava Miller case finally took shape. The main question facing the jury was formulated by the defense attorney. Was it a cold-blooded murder or a tragic accident followed by a terrible act? This line precisely became the last attempt to save Kowalski from the severest penalty. The trial lasted several weeks. Experts, forensic technicians, and police officers who had worked on the case from the first days testified during the hearings. The courtroom listened attentively as a digital evidence specialist showed, step by step on the map, the route of Kowalski's phone. The obviousness of the matches made a strong impression. Another expert demonstrated the photograph of the imprint from the roadside and the boots found in his garage. Every detail matched to the millimeter. Ava's parents were present in the courtroom. Their testimonies did not concern the evidence. They spoke about how they had lived in anticipation of their daughter's return, how they had waited for a sign of life for years. Their words were accompanied by tears, and precisely this moment became the emotional climax of the trial. Against their background, Kowalski's face remained cold, detached. He sat motionless, staring at a point, as if the events did not touch him. The defense tried to insist that everything that happened was an accident. The lawyer repeated, Kowalski had not planned it. He was afraid. He had committed a folly and then made the desperate decision to conceal his deed. But the prosecution relied not on emotions, but on facts. The cover-up, the lies during interrogations, the destruction of evidence. All of this suggested that his actions were not spontaneous, but deliberate and calculated. The jury's decision was announced after several hours of deliberation. The verdict was unanimous, guilty. The judge rose and read the sentence. Frank Kowalski received a life sentence with the possibility of parole only after 20 years. Thus ended the story that had begun with a banal family argument and ended in the courtroom. But for the residents of Port Blossom, this verdict became only an attempt to close a wound that will remain in memory for a long time. Today, the Blossom Narrows Bridge looks like a symbol of modern Port Blossom. Every day, a stream of cars flows over it. Families stroll on the sidewalks. Athletes jog. For tourists, it is a landmark. For locals, it is part of their usual route. But for those who know the story, this bridge is not only associated with progress, it became a place where concrete hid a secret for 1 year. Every day, hundreds of people pass within a few meters of what is referred to in documents as the discovery site. And for many, this thought is colder than any documentary report. The Miller family could not continue their lives in Port Blossom. After the trial, they moved to another state to avoid conversations and attention. Their house on the eastern outskirts of the city remained empty for a long time until it was sold. Neighbors said they saw the last belongings being loaded silently and without farewells. It resembled not a move, but an escape from a city where every corner reminded them of the past. Leo, the young man who was considered the main suspect for 1 year, remained. He continued to live in Port Blossom, but his life had irrevocably changed. Even after the exonerating data, people continued to whisper behind his back. For some, he remained forever the guy she argued with last. His name is forever merged with this story, and he will not be able to shed this stigma. Frank Kowalski is serving his sentence. In prison, he became the same person he was in freedom, taciturn and inconspicuous. He gave no more remorse or open confessions about his motives. The court records remain the only place where his words are preserved, and the bridge itself continues to stand. For the authorities, it is an infrastructure object, a symbol of development. But for the residents who remember the story, it became a monument to the other side of human nature. Where there should only have been concrete and steel, it became a place forever associated with the name Ava Miller. The Blossom Narrows Bridge became a scar on the body of the city. And no matter how great the flow of traffic, how many new stories unfold around it, this scar will never disappear. They cried in front of the cameras. They pleaded for help, holding hands and showing photos of their girl. On the screens, they looked like the unhappiest people in the world, and the whole town believed them. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the fields. Police with dogs checked forest belts and abandoned sheds. Donations were collected in schools to print new flyers. On each, the smile of Elisa, a girl with long blonde hair and freckles on her nose. It seemed as if all of Meerbeck was breathing for one thing, to find her. But the truth was close all along. In the same house where the parents gave interviews and received condolences. In the room where their marital bed stood. Elisa was directly beneath it. October 16, 2007. The morning of the 4th day of the search. A group of investigators re-enters the family home. Formerly, they had been here several times before. But the absence of any traces outside the house forced them to return inside. At first glance, the parents' bedroom was impeccably clean. A made bed, neatly folded pillows, the usual smell of detergent. But one of the officers paused. There was a strange aftertaste in the air. In his report, he would later write only 3 words: faint, sweetish smell. The sergeant bent down and looked under the bed. At that second, the search ended. There lay Elisa, wrapped in an old striped blanket. All this pain of the town over 4 days, the dogs, the volunteers, the television cameras, the parents' tears, could have ended on the first night, for the girl had not disappeared anywhere. She was here all along, in her own bedroom. From that moment on, the missing person report no longer existed. Before the investigators lay a new case, the case of the death of 9-year-old Elisa, which would shatter the illusion of a perfect family and uncover a terrible secret behind closed doors. To understand how it happened, one must go back 4 days, to the moment when nothing yet indicated a tragedy. Until October 12, 2007, the Peters Verlinden family lived like dozens of other families in the small Belgian town of Meerbeck. From the outside, everything looked ordinary, even boring. But precisely in this normality lay the starting point from which the minutes were later counted. The family home stood on Kerkstraat, number 14, a 2-story brick terraced house with a narrow facade and neat curtains at the windows. On the ground floor was a living room, with a dark sofa and an old television. Next to it, a kitchen that almost always smelled of coffee and toasted bread. On the first floor, there were 2 bedrooms, a large one for the parents and a small one for the child. Behind the house was a tiny yard with a wooden swing that creaked in the wind. Everything seemed so everyday that it is hard to believe that, precisely here, a few days later, the girl's body would be found. The family consisted of 3 people. Annelies Verlinden, the mother, a 33-year-old woman who worked as a nurse at the local clinic. She had a quiet, slightly tired smile and a habit of tying her hair into a careless knot. Acquaintances described her as kind and gentle, although those who knew her better spoke of her pathological dependence on her husband. Luke Peters, the stepfather. He was 37. He worked as a driver in a warehouse in the neighboring town. Tall, strong, with a loud voice and a habit of commanding around the house. He loved football and beer in the evening, and with the neighbors he was more reserved than friendly. In the eyes of others, he seemed like an ordinary worker. Nothing suspicious was known about him. And finally, Elisa, a girl with an open smile, with a small pink backpack that she carried to school. She loved to draw with felt-tip pens on the kitchen table and was constantly in her mother's way when she was preparing dinner. She had a habit of tugging at the hem of her sweater when she was nervous, and a beloved plush rabbit without which she would not sleep. It was an ordinary life. Breakfast with cornflakes, the walk to school, homework in the kitchen, calls from friends. Everything looked exactly as it should in a Belgian suburban house. October 12, 2007, became the last day of this normality. On Friday at 16:30, the school bus dropped Elisa off at the stop, 2 blocks from the house. A neighbor saw her cross the street and walk quickly towards Kerkstraat. The girl waved and disappeared behind the door of her house. That was the last time she was seen outside the family. A few hours later, this house would no longer be ordinary, and the story of the disappearance would become the first link in the chain of future investigations. The morning of October 13 in Meerbeek was gray and cool. The town lived its usual rhythm. People went to the bakery to get fresh bread. Neighbors placed garbage bins at the roadside. Here, the girl's mother, Annelies Verlinden, desperately dialed the police number. The clock showed 9:12. Her voice trembled, sobs could be heard, but through the tears she tried to speak clearly, as if she had chosen the words in advance. She was playing in the backyard last night. I was distracted. When I called her, she wasn't there. These sentences would later be literally recorded in the report. A minute later, Luke Peters, the stepfather, picked up the phone. His speech was more composed. He assured that he had immediately started searching. I checked the street, looked at the neighbors, circled the park. She's nowhere. Their versions matched, as if they had rehearsed the story together. And precisely this story became the starting point for the police. Shortly thereafter, the first patrol arrived at the house. Neighbors looked out of windows and saw Annelies and Luke repeatedly telling the same story. The daughter was playing, the mother was distracted for a moment, the garden gate was not locked. Everything seemed possible, and at the same time, terrible. In a quiet town, the idea that someone could abduct a girl directly from the yard sounded alien, but that's exactly how it was recorded: a disappearance. By noon, the police created wanted posters. They stated Elisa's characteristics and the last place she was seen. In the central square, volunteers were already distributing the first flyers. The black and white photo with her smile quickly spread through the town. People took them, put them in their pockets, pasted them on posts. In the evening, a heavy silence reigned in the house on Kerkstraat, broken only by the ringing of the telephone. Annelies and Luke received condolences, and at the same time told the same story to journalists. To the viewers on the other side of the screen, they looked like inconsolable parents, and no one yet suspected that something entirely different was hidden behind this image. Thus, a personal tragedy became a sensational investigation within a few hours. Elisa's disappearance became an official case, and the parents' version, that the daughter had disappeared from the yard, was now the baseline against which investigators would compare every detail. The search unfolded very quickly. Already on the evening of October 13, dozens of police officers, volunteers from neighboring towns, and journalists were involved in the case. For quiet Meerbeek, this was an event of unprecedented scale. People in bright vests scoured fields, dogs searched for traces. Even a helicopter was used from the air. It seemed as if it was impossible to simply disappear here. But precisely in this general mobilization lay the greatest paradox. Despite the enormous effort, nothing was found. No shoe print, no lost item, no accidental witness. Emptiness. As if the girl had disappeared directly behind the garden gate. The neighbors were questioned down to the last one. Someone remembered her laughter during the day. Someone saw her on the swing. But after the evening of October 12, not a single mention. As if the whole block had suddenly stopped noticing her presence. The days of searching dragged on in disturbing silence. The town came alive in the evening when the parents' appeal was broadcast on television. In the picture, Luke Peters looked directly into the camera and said in a muffled voice, "Give us back our daughter." These words were repeated in the news, and residents across the country listened and suffered with them. But behind this drama lay a detail that the investigators themselves could not ignore. With so many people, so much technology, dogs, and checks, there wasn't the slightest clue. No camera on which the girl's figure had appeared. No eyewitness who had noticed a car or a passerby. This emptiness became more and more disturbing. The investigation seemed to run into a concrete wall, and precisely this forced the police to make a decision that would change the entire course of the story, to return to where everything began and examine it again. This time, not with the eyes of neighbors, but with the gaze of someone who harbors suspicion. When the days of searching yielded no results, the investigators did what they always do in such cases. If there isn't a single trace outside, one must look inside, in the closest environment. This is simple logic. Most crimes are committed by those who are nearby, and here, attention immediately fell on one person, the family's neighbor, Mr. Dubois. He was 72, he had lived in the house opposite for many years. In the town, he was known as a grumpy old man. He regularly complained to the municipality about noise, argued with teenagers, demanded that children not run onto his property. He also had a tense relationship with Annalise and her husband, because of the lawn, because of the swing, and Elisa herself had more than once run to him to grab apples that fell from his trees. These small conflicts suddenly seemed less harmless. The records mention several official complaints from Dubois about the family. To the investigators, this looked like a potential motive, and already in the evening, they knocked on his door. The interrogation took place in the presence of a lawyer. The old man did not deny it. Yes, he had indeed argued with the neighbors. Yes, he did not like that the girl ran through his flower beds. But he assured that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. More so, he had an explanation for where he had been that evening. According to his words, he had driven to the supermarket in the neighboring town. There, he had bought groceries, bread, milk, medicine. The receipts were kept at the checkout, and surveillance cameras had recorded him in the store. The police still had to verify this, but at first glance the alibi seemed convincing. Nevertheless, Mr. Dubois became an official suspect until the documents were confirmed. His name was discussed by the neighbors. His photo appeared in the reports. Against the background of the family's despair and the large-scale search, the version of the grumpy neighbor with old grudges seemed too convenient to ignore. Thus, the investigation took its first detour, diverting from the house and focusing on an external conflict. But this trail would not last long. The verification of the alibi would soon direct attention back to where it had so hastily deviated. When the investigation ran out of external versions, its choice became obvious. Every alibi is checked not by words, but by the time on a screen. If someone says they were far away, the time, receipt, and the way home must match. This is a simple, cold calculation, and at that moment it concerned one person, the neighbor about whom the whole block was already whispering, as if everyone had long been angry at him. Mr. Dubois gave exact figures. Del Hayes, Friday, around 7 in the evening. I was there for milk and bread. The period, 1845 to 1920. These were exactly the minutes when Elisa, according to Annalise, was playing in the yard and then was no longer heard. That is, if the old man was telling the truth, he could not physically be at the garden gate at the right moment. And this now had to be proven, not disproven. First, the supermarket archives were requested. In 2007, Del Hayes already had a network of cameras at the entrance door, above the milk shelves, at the checkouts, and in the shopping cart return area. The manager downloaded the recordings for the required period, Heavy boxes with hard drives were brought directly to the station. No romance, just blinking time stamps and an image that had to be slowed down, frame by frame. On the way to the entrance, at 1847, a man in a beige coat and a dark soft-brimmed hat appears. He walks slowly, holding the door open with his shoulder. In his hand, he holds a foldable shopping bag, like the ones bought at the market in the past. His face is visible in the lens for a few seconds, and that's enough. He is unmistakably recognizable from the neighbor's photos. On the next camera, he is seen taking a small shopping cart and going to the refrigerators. The seconds pass as numbers in the corner of the screen. 1849, he puts a liter of milk in the basket. 1851, he chooses a pistolet bread labeled freshly baked. 1854, he lingers at the shelf with hygiene products, takes a pack of disposable razors. Random shoppers rush past, creating a lively scene. But they are not the most important thing. The rhythm is important. In no episode does he disappear from the store's space for longer than a few seconds. He simply moves from shelf to shelf. At 1909, he stands at the checkout with the blue number. The cashier scans the purchases. The audio track clearly records the pulsating beep, each item confirmed on the screen. The receipt is printed at 1912. On the thermal paper, the shift number, checkout number, operator's name, and 4 items remain: milk, bread, razors, antacid tablets. Next to it, the last 4 digits of the loyalty card. Everything matches this document down to the last character. Exit, 1915. The camera at the door catches him pressing the bag to his chest, unbuttoning his coat. It's cool outside, the Belgian October sky without illusions. He walks past the shopping cart station, stopping for only a few seconds to adjust the glove. Then, the parking lot. In the overall view, a silhouette is visible as he gets into his old Renault, the color of wet asphalt, and drives onto the main road. Timestamp, 1916 minutes, 32 seconds. Even if one imagines the unimaginable and instantly transports him back to the house, the minutes do not match. Physics does not allow it. These recordings were soberly checked. The receipt was compared. The number matched the cash register receipt. It was checked whether the loyalty card actually belonged to Dubois. An application form in his name, the same date of birth, the same phone number. They didn't even have to open the old man's refrigerator. The packages of milk and bread with the same barcode lay where he had placed them, and the packaging time was preserved on the packaging. The evening of October 12, someone wanted to cling to a small detail. Perhaps this half hour was not the right interval, but precisely in this interval, the last witnesses heard music from the family living room and laughter that then ceased. Everything fell into place. At the moment Elisa disappeared, according to the parents' version, the neighbor was under a dozen cameras and paying at the checkout. His path was recorded, the money debited. The salesperson later remembered the customer with the hat because they had exchanged a few words about the weather. When one crosses a person off the list, a taste of emptiness remains, for with it, one also extinguishes the hope of a simple solution. But here, the investigation did not allow itself emotions. A dry note was made. Alibi confirmed. Exclude from the circle of suspects. The evening of the same day passed with the creation of a new report without the name Dubois. And here the field abruptly narrowed. There were no more external conflicts. They failed to record strange cars on the streets. No camera on the way to school or the bus stop had captured her silhouette. The volunteer groups returned empty-handed, and the search maps closed one window after another. There were simply no more external options. Then they decided to proceed differently, not to look for outward movement, but to restart the story from within. Not who kidnapped her, but what happened in the house before and after. The team identified 3 points of interest: the backyard, the basement, and the bedroom where the spouses stored their bedding. The plan looked like a usual routine: check cabinets, move dressers, measure crevices, check for smells. But precisely this ordinariness often saves cases, because the truth does not hide in tricks, but in centimeters. The date of the new search was quickly set: Tuesday morning, October 16. No press releases, no loud declarations, just a carefully planned route and a list of tasks on each level of the house. By this time, the town was tired of uncertainty, and the parents continued to play the role of a family that had lost its dearest. The investigators went there without expectations, but with the readiness to record every small detail that had previously been overlooked. Thus, the lead to the neighbor was officially closed, and the vacuum it left forced the investigation to where no one initially wanted to look: inside, into the rooms where everything looked tidy and quiet. Now, every step, every breath within these walls would matter, for the next discovery was already hidden very close, much closer than anyone wanted to admit. Before leaving, the team leader distributed disposable gloves and paper over shoes. The house was not to be contaminated with foreign traces. Simple things were noted in the notebook: the temperature in the rooms, which windows were ajar, what the kitchen smelled like. Photo scales and flashlights were placed at the top of the bag, next to a small serrated mirror on a long handle, which is convenient for looking under furniture. Even the dog was not to be brought along at first, so as not to disturb the original scent profile. Everything was to begin with a quiet, almost everyday inspection, precisely the one where lies usually stumble, at the small details that cannot be synchronized. With this step, the second round of investigations would begin, and it would lead them to a discovery from which they could no longer turn away. When the lead to the neighbor collapsed, all attention inevitably focused on the family itself. Now, every gesture, every word from Annalise and Luke began to sound different. Where one previously saw grief, one began to notice oddities. The parents received the search teams in their house as if nothing unusual had happened. In the reports, volunteers recalled that Annalise herself offered coffee and cookies, invited them to sit down, even though her daughter was considered missing. One might think it was care, but in the context of the disappearance, it seemed almost unnatural. For most mothers in such moments, hands tremble, words get tangled, but here everything was too orderly. To the police's questions, they answered uniformly, briefly, reservedly, without details, as if they were repeating the same text. She was playing, I went out, she was no longer there. We searched but found nothing. The same sentences, over and over again, without additions, without emotional outbursts. Precisely this behavior led to the involvement of a psychologist. His conclusion is preserved in the files. The emotions shown are learned, not spontaneous. In other words, the grief seemed rehearsed. Luke stood out particularly. In front of the camera, he spoke loudly with emphasized determination. Give us back our daughter. But outside the lenses, he was perceived as silent, absent, as if he had played his role and then retreated back into himself. Neighbors noticed that he barely participated in the search on the street, stayed closer to the house, smoked at the garden gate, and avoided conversations. Of course, all of this was not direct evidence. People grieve in different ways, and no expert could say, it shouldn't be like this. But precisely such small things prompted the investigators to change their approach. If the house had previously been formally searched, the renewed search was now planned with particular attention to detail. And already the next day, this determination would lead them to a discovery that would dash hopes for a happy outcome. The morning of October 16 began like the 3 previous ones. In the town, search operations continued, volunteers put up new flyers, and repeated appeals were broadcast on television. But for the investigative team, this day was to be different. At 9 o'clock in the morning, they returned to the house, determined to conduct a search, this time without regard for politeness towards the affected family. This is where the turning point begins. As Officer Peters entered the parents' bedroom, he noticed not the furniture or the order, but the smell. At first it was barely perceptible, almost dissolved in the air, but as he approached the bed, it became more intrusive. In his report, he later wrote a short line. The smell intensified at the head of the bed and in the lower part of the room. A normal person might have attributed this to mold or damp laundry, but experience told him otherwise. He pulled out a flashlight, bent down, and began to illuminate the space under the furniture. Dust, scraps of paper, a pair of old slippers, and a dark silhouette wrapped in cloth. The blanket was old, with faded yellow and gray stripes. It lay as a bundle, but the shape spoke for itself. The investigator's heart, in his words, beat faster than he would have liked. He called a colleague. Together they carefully pulled the bundle closer. At that moment, silence fell in the house. Even those in the kitchen fell silent when they noticed the change in the officers' voices. When the cloth was unfolded, everything became definitively clear. There was Elisa. For the investigation, it was a shock, but protocol required action. The operations leader immediately ordered the arrest of Annalise and Luke. They didn't even have time to exchange words. The handcuffs clicked directly in the living room. The house was sealed, an additional vehicle drove to the gate. Outside, neighbors began to gather, not understanding what was happening. The volunteers who had come here for coffee only an hour earlier stood stunned. The image shattered before their eyes. From the role of inconsolable parents, Annalise and Luke instantly became the main suspects. From that moment on, the search campaign was over. The investigation into what had happened within these walls began, and each new discovery would show more and more. The tragedy had not come from outside, but from within the family. When the bundle with Elisa's body was taken to the morgue, the emotional story turned into a dry and cold one. From now on, everything depended on the experts. They were the ones who had to answer the most important question: what had really happened to the girl? The initial examination was carried out quickly. Already in the report, it was announced that the body showed no signs of violence, no bruises, no fractures, no characteristic injuries that could be associated with an abduction or assault. This immediately destroyed the image that the parents had maintained for days. After that, the experts paid attention to something else. The skin had a marbled hue, and the internal organs showed changes typical of hypothermia. The report recorded the formulation, cause of death, hypothermia. The girl did not die from a blow, not from suffocation, but from cold. But even more important was the timing. According to the condition of the tissues, death occurred approximately 80 to 90 hours before the time of discovery. This meant that the tragedy happened on the evening of October 12, the same day the mother last saw her alive. The conclusion sounded like a death sentence for the abduction version. It was cold in the town at the time, but not so cold that one would freeze to death in a few hours outdoors. The expertise showed it happened in an enclosed space, without movement, where the temperature remained low for longer. Thus arose a paradox that could no longer be ignored. Elisa had not disappeared on the street. No one had taken her by force. She had died of cold in the house. And now the questions to the parents changed. No longer, what do you know about her disappearance? But how did your daughter freeze to death under your roof? Precisely from this moment on, the interrogations of Annalise and Luke become the key to solving the whole story. The expert's report hit like a cold blow. Elisa had died of cold, and she had died at home. For Annalise and Luke, this meant one thing. Their story of disappearance collapsed before their eyes. But in the first hours after their arrest, they still tried to cling to another version that could somehow explain the found body. During the interrogation, their answers sounded synchronized, as if they had been rehearsed. Annalise repeated, "Someone must have broken into our house. I heard nothing, saw nothing." Luke added, "We didn't hide her. That's impossible. Someone put her there when we weren't home." Again and again, they clung to the image of an unknown attacker like a last straw. The investigators recorded every detail. In their eyes, such a defense seemed desperate. For it was the parents who first opened the doors to the police. They should have noticed a foreign intruder, but neither in their words nor in their gestures was there any conviction. Everything resembled more a panicked attempt to come up with anything. Meanwhile, the forensic technicians did their work. They examined the windows, checked the locks, took prints from the door frames. The final report dryly stated, no signs of forced entry found, no indications of intrusion. Even the doors to the backyard had untouched latches, dust, and cobwebs on the frames. No stranger had entered or exited. This result put an end to the intrusion version. There was no third person. And with that, the investigation was left with only two people who could know what had really happened, the mother and the stepfather. Thus, their role in the eyes of the public changed definitively. Yesterday's parents of the victim now became the only suspects, and ahead of them lay long hours of interrogations, where there was no longer any room for general phrases. The investigators were interested in the truth, and only in it. After the intruder version finally collapsed, the investigators had no doubt. The solution had to be sought within the family itself. But for that, one had to understand who Luke Peters was outside the role of a caring stepfather, as he was known by those who encountered him in everyday life. On television screens, he appeared reserved and self-assured. His sentences sounded as if they had been prepared in advance. "We have lost our dearest. Give us back our daughter." But outside the cameras, the picture was different. The investigators began to collect fragments of his past, and gradually, a disturbing portrait emerged from these pieces. The first step was the school. Elisa's class teacher recalled an episode. The girl came one day with a distinct bruise on her forearm. When asked where it came from, Elisa quietly replied, "I fell off the swing." She looked away and seemed afraid to continue the conversation. The teacher decided then not to make a fuss, as children often fall. But now, it looked different. In the report, she admitted, "Her words sounded forced. I saw fear in her for the first time." Then, it was Annalie's friend's turn. The woman hesitated for a long time, but finally spoke of Luke's short temper. He could fly into a rage over a trifle. Once, right in front of her, during dinner, he grabbed a plate and smashed it against the wall. Shards flew across the floor. Annalie silently cleaned them up, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The friend added, "I understood that she was used to his outbursts. She always defended him. Always." The neighbors also gave statements. One man said Luke often stood in the yard with a cigarette, angrily throwing butts over the fence, without paying attention to the possibility of children playing there. Another neighbor recalled screams in the evening. She did not understand the words, but the intonations were heavy and sharp. Once, she heard a loud bang, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. "I thought it was another argument, but I decided not to interfere," she said. Colleagues at the warehouse added their own details. Luck was a good driver, but everyone knew his character. Once, he slammed a truck door so violently that the mirror broke. Another time, he yelled at an intern over swapped documents. According to a colleague, he could be normal, but if something went wrong, he immediately exploded. These scenes did not appear criminal, but they said something about his temperament. Even the family confirmed that Luke had always been a difficult person. His sister remembered that even as a teenager, he would fight over football and beat a classmate so badly that he needed stitches. The case was covered up at the time. Later, at 20 years old, he had his first live-in partner. Their relationship ended quickly, and the reason, according to acquaintances, was Luke's character. He boiled over too quickly. She couldn't stand it. These testimonies could not be considered evidence. In Elisa's medical records, there were no traces of serious injuries. The police were never called to their house, and there were no official complaints. But the sum of small details created a picture of a short-tempered man who could not control himself. And it was precisely this image that the investigators began to use as leverage. During the interrogations, the questions sounded harsh. Why did the neighbors hear screams? Why did the teacher see bruises? Why does your wife remain silent when it comes to disputes? It became increasingly difficult for Luke to evade answers. Even if each story could be explained individually, together they painted a disturbing picture. For Annalise, the situation was agonizing. She sat next to him, listening as the investigators, step by step, destroyed her husband's protective facade. She understood that the truth would soon come to light, and her own silence only made her more complicit. Before the investigators' eyes, it became clear. Tension was growing between the spouses, and it could lead to a turning point. Thus, the investigation gradually discarded superfluous versions and approached the core of the matter. There was no direct evidence yet, but the police had in their hands the portrait of a man who could not control himself. And it was precisely through this portrait that they prepared to take the decisive step, to confront husband and wife with each other, to force them to speak the truth. The interrogations began immediately after all indirect statements had been collected. The investigators understood. Now they had enough arguments to destroy the kidnapping narrative built by the parents. All that remained was to use these arguments correctly. Normally, spouses are separated in such cases. This is not a formality, but a proven tactic. Isolated from each other, they lose the ability to align their statements, and every inconsistency becomes a leverage point. So, it was here. Luke was led into one room, Annalise into another. Luke was immediately presented with the expert's report. Cause of death, hypothermia. It sounded cold and clear. The investigator placed a printout of the protocol on the table, stating the time of death as the evening of October 12, almost immediately after Elisa was last seen alive. This is not a kidnapping. This happened in your house. Explain how a child could freeze to death under your roof. Luke remained silent. He did not contradict, but he also did not confirm anything. He only clenched his fists and turned to the wall. Annalise was handled differently. She was told immediately, Your husband is silent, but all the evidence points to him. If you continue to remain silent, the blame will also fall on you. The investigator spoke calmly, without shouting, but every word sounded like a judgment. Photos of the bedroom where the body was found, and records from the neighbors' protocols were placed on the table. The psychological pressure was increased. The teacher saw a bruise. The neighbors heard arguments. You yourself know what your husband was like. Annalise sat motionless, but her gestures betrayed her. She was torn. She plucked at the edge of a napkin with her fingers, then folded her hands as if praying. Meanwhile, Luke continued to be spoken to harshly. He was shown photos of the blanket Elisa was wrapped in. This is from your basement. The fibers match. Do you understand that we know the truth? He remained silent, but his face grew redder, his breathing heavier. The climax came in Annalise's room. They repeated to her, Luke is not protecting you. He is silent, and silence is a confession. But you can't explain that it was an accident, and then your role will be different. This sentence was the trigger. Her confession is preserved in the protocol. In a soft voice, after a long pause, she said, It was an accident. He didn't mean to. These words sounded like a turning point. For the first time in the entire investigation, there was a version that could explain Elisa's death within the family. And from this very moment, the investigation moves to the core of the matter, how exactly everything happened that evening. The experts began with the fabric. The fibers of the blanket in which the bundle was wrapped matched samples from a box of old laundry in the basement. The same medium-spun cotton fabric, the same yellow-gray stripes, the same fracture structure under polarized light. Tiny manufacturing defects were found on both samples, the signature of a single machine. The wording in the report sounded simple: identity due to the totality of characteristics. The probability of a random coincidence is negligibly small. In other words, the blanket was taken precisely from the basement. Then the dust, which always betrays the room, microparticles of lime, rust, and lubricant were found on the fabric, a mixture characteristic of the farthest corner of the basement, where that very box stood. The same dust lay on the lower shelf and on an old mattress hidden nearby, just in case. A thread of the same color was found in the stairwell, caught on the windowsill. Someone had carried the bundle upstairs, leaving this tiny trace. Crucial were the fingerprints. On the inside of the basement door, at the height of a child's hand, there was a chain of Elisa's clear finger lines. They stretched towards the handle, as if she had tried to hold on and get out. The comparison with her reference card showed a complete match. Slightly higher, the broad hand of an adult. Based on the papillary line pattern and the arrangement of the flexion creases, Luke was identified. These traces did not show a struggle, but the usual closing of a door from the inside by an adult's hand. The temperature note added context. In such a basement, with the door closed, the temperature remains below room temperature, humidity is high, and heat escapes quickly. With immobility and light clothing, hypothermia occurs significantly faster than in a living space. This matched the forensic expert's conclusion about the cause of death and the presumed time, the evening of October 12. All data were presented to the spouses separately. Annalise was shown photos of the fingerprints on the door, a close-up of the thread on the windowsill, and a table of the fibers. She remained silent for a long time, covering her face with her hands. Luke was shown the same materials point by point. The fabric, his house, the dust, their basement, the prints, his hand next to the child's. He pushed the photos away, but there was nothing substantial to object to. From this moment on, the intrusion version did not even exist as a hypothesis. The physical evidence connected the basement and the bedroom with a direct line. The blanket was taken downstairs, the bundle carried upstairs. Traces were left at every step. These were no longer anyone's words, but a material trace that cannot be rewritten after the fact. Thus, the foundation that Annalise's confession had lacked was created. The investigators no longer asked the question, where? The question, how did this happen minute by minute, remained. Who closed the door? How long did the girl spend downstairs? At what point was the decision made to hide the bundle under the bed? The next part will answer these points. The reconstruction of the evening of October 12 with a minute-by-minute analysis of the paths in the house and the points at which the choice could have been different. When the laboratory data finally destroyed her defense, Annalise had neither the strength nor the words for new excuses. What she had tried to hide for 4 days burst out of her. This was the moment when her defense collapsed and the truth was heard for the first time without masks. She began with the trifle that was the cause of the tragedy. On the evening of October 12, Elisa was playing in the living room and accidentally bumped into a shelf. From there, a vase fell, an expensive wedding gift. The shards flew across the floor. Luke, according to her words, exploded instantly. His scream shook the walls, and the girl pressed herself against her mother. But instead of calming down, he grabbed her arm and dragged her down to the basement. "She's to sit there and think," he snapped, slamming the heavy door shut. Annalise heard her daughter crying and calling out, but Luke was unyielding. He sat down in front of the television, turned on a football game, and poured himself a beer. Minutes passed and turned into hours. Annalise tried to remind him about the basement, but he waved her off. "I'll let her out in 1 hour." More than 3 hours passed. When Luke finally went down and opened the door, the basement was already silent. Elisa lay on the floor, cold and motionless. Panic immediately gripped both of them. Annalise pleaded to call an ambulance, but Luke said it was all over and now their lives were destroyed. He insisted they had to pretend it was a kidnapping. During the night, they carried the body upstairs. They wrapped it in an old blanket from the basement and hid it under the marital bed. In the morning, Annalise called the police and spoke the memorized words. "She was playing in the yard, I was distracted, she was no longer there." Thus, the legend of the kidnapping was created, which lasted exactly 4 days. Now, her confession revealed what had really happened. The investigators recorded every detail. Only one last thing remained, to verify her words and compare them with the evidence. This was precisely what would put the final exclamation mark on the family's version. After Annalise's confession, the investigators had one last gap, exactly how the spouses had concealed what happened in the house. The story of the accident explained the cause, but did not show the full horror in detail. And it was these details that completed the picture. The night of October 13. The house is quiet. Only the sound of the television still hums in the living room. Luke and Annalise go to the basement. He carries an old striped blanket. She holds a flashlight in her hands. Down on the floor lies their daughter. In a panic, they act quickly. They wrap the body in the fabric, tie the knots tightly so that nothing is visible. No words, just quick movements. Breath-catching, footsteps echoing on the concrete steps. They lift the bundle upstairs. The house is dark. The neighbors are asleep. A thread gets caught in the stairwell. Dust falls. The experts will later find this and cite it as key evidence. But at this moment, they only think of hiding it. The bedroom door is ajar, and they go there, as if the most terrible secret could be laid to rest there. The blanket is hidden under the bed. The low gap, where one usually shoves boxes or old shoes, becomes the place for the bundle. Everything, hidden. They lie down on the same bed, and the night continues. Morning. Annalise dials the police number. Her voice trembles, but the words are memorized. "She was playing in the yard, I was distracted, she was no longer there." Luke stands next to her, nodding, repeating the story to the neighbors. The search begins. At this moment, the girl is no longer in the house, but in the bedroom, a meter from their pillows. The blanket lies all the time. The days passed identically. Daytime, the search, nighttime, the silence of the bedroom. They drink coffee in the kitchen, let volunteers in, receive journalists, show photos. And at night, they return to the bedroom and sleep there, where the bundle is hidden. Every step, every sentence in public is a mask. The investigators reconstructed this mechanism almost minutely. Night, the transport, morning, the call, days, the search, evenings, the staging of grief. Now the investigators had not only the cause and the motive, but also a complete reconstruction of how the tragedy had turned into a spectacle. When the investigations were completed, the story was moved to where dots are placed, the courtroom. Two people who once represented a family and were now defendants in a sensational case sat in the dock. The silence was so great that one could hear the judge turning the pages. Everyone awaited the final word that would translate the tragedy into the language of the law. The prosecutor rose and read the charges. Luke Peters was charged with negligent homicide under aggravating circumstances, failure to render assistance in a dangerous situation leading to death. Annelies Verlinden was found guilty of obstruction of justice and misleading the police. The prosecutor spoke in a dry voice, but every word sounded as if carved in stone. Then it was the lawyer's turn. Luke sat with his head bowed. His defender tried to mitigate the guilt, describing what happened as a fatal error and a loss of control. Annelies behaved more calmly. Her lawyer emphasized that she had acted under her husband's pressure and out of fear of losing everything. But the evidence collected by the investigation already spoke louder than any words. When the judge stood up, the courtroom held its breath. The decision was short and harsh. Luke Peters is sentenced to 18 years in prison. Annelies Verlinden to 5 years probation for obstruction of justice. These words were the finale of a story that began with the search for a missing girl and ended with the revelation within the house. But for the investigators, there remained another layer. A question not about the law, but about how people can live for 4 days, sleeping inches away from what they tried to hide. After the verdict, the case did not fade from the city's memory. It could not disappear. Too much connected people to this house and this family. But the story went beyond court records and lived on, now as a scar. Luke Peters was transferred to a high-security prison. For the first years, he tried to appeal the verdict, but without success. Now, he remains behind bars, with many more years ahead of him. His name is no longer spoken aloud in the city. The neighbors prefer to say he, or simply remain silent. Annelies Verlinden changed her last name after probation. She left Meerbeek and moved to relatives in another region. No one knows exactly how she lives now. Those who remember her describe a broken woman with a constantly downcast gaze. The house where everything happened stood empty for a long time. It was only sold after several years. The new owner carried out a core renovation. He rebuilt the bedrooms, replaced the stairs, and completely poured concrete into the basement. For the neighbors, this became a symbol that the past can somehow be buried. But they still walk past this house in silence, without lifting their gaze. And yet, one circumstance remained as a shadow over the case. No one could ultimately determine exactly how much time Elisa had spent in the basement before she died. According to some statements, it was several hours. According to others, almost an entire day. The contradictions between the parents' words could never be resolved. The expertise only set an approximate time frame, but the exact time remained beyond the truth. So this story lives on, with a verdict, with a punishment, with a destroyed house, and with an unanswered question. A question that will not put a final end to it, and which makes it even more terrible.